Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Season 2, Episode 3, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. This was a La'an episode. It begins with La'an going around the ship, mediating disputes, investigating complaints, and enforcing rules. She dealt with some minor squabbles, told Spock to practice his music at a lower volume, although should you really be able to hear anything outside his quarters? Whatever. She even searches Commander Pelia's belongings for stolen items. A lot of the items are marked property of the archaeology department. Pelia says she still has a bunker in Vermont in case this whole socialist utopian thing turns out to be a fad. Then we see La'an sparring with Dr. M'Benga. He makes an observation that La'an skipped Una's welcome back party and tells La'an she doesn't need to be lonely. Next, we see La'an in the corridor, and a man wearing modern clothing with a gunshot wound materializes out of nowhere. He tells her there's been an attack in the past, and she has to stop it. He gives her a device and tells her she needs to get to the bridge. La'an thinks he means the bridge of the Enterprise, so after the man disappears, she heads to the bridge. This is when La'an discovers Captain James Kirk in the captain's chair. Uhura and Ortegas are there, with slightly different uniforms, but Spock comes on the view screen as the captain of a Vulcan ship. The Vulcans are at war with the Romulans, and Spock is asking the United Earth Fleet for assistance. Captain Kirk says he's sorry, but Earth can't help them. Apparently Earth is at war with the Romulans too. It's clear La'an is in an alternate timeline. We next see La'an trying to explain the situation to Captain Kirk, that something has gone wrong in the past and his timeline isn't supposed to exist. He seems to believe her, but then he tries to take the device the time guy gave to La'an away from her, causing the device to activate, and they are both sent to the past. He seems panicky as he takes the device from her and tries poking it repeatedly in a vain attempt to return to his present. Then he's blaming her. She asks if he has a tricorder or anything, and it's obvious he has nothing on him. They walk to a common area of the city, surrounded by buildings that say things like Toronto Eaton Center, and Kirk says that he thinks they're in New York City. There's a screen that says Budget Overruns on Lake Ontario Bridge. And in the background, it looks like there's something that says Dr. Keeler. I don't know if that was on purpose or if that was even Keeler back there, but that's what it looked like to me. La'an points out his mistake, and Kirk says he's never been to Earth. He was born on the USS Iowa. He's cold, and La'an says it's going to get colder when night falls, so they have to get cold weather gear. They go into a Roots clothing store, and Kirk has trouble with the revolving door. She says, "Never seen a revolving door before?" And he says, "I'm from space." Then she tells him to find an outfit and points out the changing rooms. They try on a few outfits, and they walk out of the fitting room in the same outfit, so he's sent back into the fitting room to change. He leaves the drape slightly open, and La'an is checking him out while he takes his shirt off. But then she thinks better of what she's doing and turns away. When he finally finds suitable clothing, it occurs to La'an that they'll have to pay for the clothes. La'an's answer to this is to pick an item off the rack and drop it into another customer's bag. When the customer tries to leave, the alarm goes off, and she and Kirk walk out with their stolen clothing, which was kind of a cruel thing to do to an innocent bystander. They dump their old clothing in the trash, and La'an points out that they're going to need money for everything. Kirk says he's got it covered, and proceeds to hustle people in the park playing chess. No idea where his seed money came from, or how he managed to make enough for a fancy downtown Toronto hotel, but now they have a whole lot of money. He talks about how he used to play chess with his first officer until she got sick of losing to him, and he's been looking for a proper opponent ever since. Then he calls the old-fashioned two-dimensional version of chess idiot's chess. He then stops by a hot dog vendor, and he gets 2 hot dogs and offers one to La'an, which she says she doesn't want. Of course, why would she take his hot dog with no condiments on it? He tries ordering her to take his hot dog, and she tells him she doesn't work for him, so he's stuck standing there with his hot dog in his hand. They have a somewhat nice moment where he sees the sunset on Earth for the first time, and then he proceeds to tell her she shouldn't pass up a good hot dog when she can get it. La'an finally relents and takes his hot dog. He takes a big bite of the second hot dog and says he's going back for another, leaving La'an standing there with his hot dog in her hand. It's okay to laugh. It's now night, and they're in a fancy hotel. La'an has the bed and Kirk gets the couch. Why they couldn't stay in a cheaper hotel with 2 beds, I don't know. She gets up at one point and is looking at him on the couch. I suppose this is supposed to be a romantic tension moment. They even do the old he wakes up and looks, but she's already gone back to bed missed moment. The following morning begins with a shot of the bridge that goes from Toronto across Lake Ontario. So you can tell this is definitely not reality, because there's been a need for another bridge between southern Ontario and western New York for decades, and we are nowhere near getting another bridge. La'an is making a list of what she remembers of 21st century history, and asks Kirk to do the same, so they can figure out what's changed. But Kirk would rather check out the minibar. He tells her that he understands the situation, that if he helps her, his timeline ceases to exist. They argue, and he says, I suppose you come from some sort of utopia. She points out that her Earth still has sunsets. She tells him he could be an explorer instead of fighting a war. He responds that it's possible that he doesn't exist in her timeline at all. She tells him he does exist. They've never met, but she's heard stories about him from his brother. This gets Kirk's attention, because his brother is dead in his timeline. And that is when the bridge blows up in the background. La'an says, "Get to the bridge," which is what the time traveler told her when she first encountered him in the corridor on the Enterprise. They go to the bridge and realize that the bridge explosion happened in both of their timelines, so this can't be the attack La'an was warned about. A chunk of bridge goes by on a cart, and La'an notices something odd about the blast pattern on it. She asks a woman nearby if she can look at the photos the woman just took, and La'an realizes the blast was caused by a photonic torpedo. Workers load the piece of bridge chunk into the back of a van, and La'an says they have to follow them. Kirk points out that they won't be able to keep up on foot. La'an points out that most vehicles have private ownership in this time, and Kirk responds, "Oh, I know." Kirk gives a guy a Vulcan neck pinch and takes the guy's keys. La'an asks Kirk where he learned to do that, and Kirk says he spent 6 months in prison with a Vulcan cellmate, and he can also make soup in a toilet. They steal a very conspicuous car. Kirk is driving, and at first puts the car in reverse, so we can all remember that we've seen him do that before. We then have the world's lamest chase scene. During the van chase, La'an makes fun of Kirk's middle name, and he says, "You're one to talk, La'an Noonien Sung." That's when La'an realizes that Kirk has never heard her last name before. Construction has stopped traffic and the van gets away. Kirk throws the car in reverse, the music kicks up, and he tells La'an to hang on. They catch up with the van, but fly by a cop. The van gets away, and La'an and Kirk are detained by the police. The woman who was taking pictures at the bridge shows up, and she's recording the arrest, asking the cops if they have their cameras on and are recording, and she asks if La'an and Kirk are being profiled for being American, and continues to give the cops a hard time. The cops finally give up and let Kirk and La'an go with a warning. The woman calls herself Sarah, and makes herself out to be a conspiracy nut. Kirk and La'an think this until she shows them a picture of a Romulan ship. Sarah then takes off. Kirk tells La'an he remembers now. There's an experimental cold fusion reactor in Toronto that gets blown up by the Romulans and blows Toronto off the map. La'an says that doesn't happen in her timeline, and now they know what attack they have to prevent. But now, how do they find a cold fusion reactor somewhere in the city of Toronto? They need an engineer to build them a cold fusion detector, ideally one that won't ask a lot of questions. La'an then realizes that Commander Pelia is currently in Vermont. It turns out the archaeology department is actually an antique store, and Commander Pelia isn't an engineer yet, so they do some mumbo-jumbo with an old Timex watch and make a tritium detector. Somehow La'an and Kirk make it back across the border in what seems like no time at all, considering the distance between Vermont and Toronto. That's pretty amazing. They are walking the streets of Toronto with their Timex tritium detector at night, looking for the reactor. Kirk says he would rather live in La'an's timeline, and he understands that his timeline will be coming to an end. La'an says, "What if you could?" implying it live in her timeline. She talks about using the time device to protect him and bring him with her. She opens up about letting people in and letting go of her heritage, then they kiss. The watch detector activates. They've located the reactor. They go inside the building and discover the Noonien Singh Institute for Cultural Advancement. La'an puts her hand on the hand scanner and the door somehow opens. Apparently there's some sort of genetic marker that opens this door, which makes no sense, considering that they've got little Khan locked up inside, but we'll get to that in a moment. That's when Sarah shows up behind them with a gun, and it turns out she is a Romulan from the future. Kirk won't let Sarah through the door and says alarms will go off and security will show up if she shoots them. She tells him he's bluffing. He says, "Try me," and she shoots him. Kirk tells La'an to say hi to Sam for him, and then he dies. La'an tries to attack Sarah, but Sarah overpowers her, and they go through the door, leaving dead Kirk in the hallway. Sarah shoots a few security guards and tells La'an they aren't going to the reactor anymore. They head for this genetics lab. There's a door there that says Khan, and there are drawings made by a child hanging on the wall. Sarah tells La'an to open the door to Khan's room. A computer simulation has told the Romulans that killing Khan will prevent the Federation from ever forming. Sarah's been trapped there for 30 years. All of this was supposed to happen in 1992. So we now have confirmation that this is a different timeline. Sarah tries to convince La'an to kill Lil Khan and to just save herself. La'an doesn't go for it. They fight and Sarah manages to get La'an's hand on the scanner to open the door. They fight some more. La'an gets the gun and she shoots Sarah. Sarah then does a suicide cremation, and that's the end of Sarah. The light on the time device turns green, and La'an can now return to her own time. Khan's door is open, and La'an goes inside. A little boy is hiding behind the bed and asks La'an if she's going to kill him. She says no and puts the gun down. She dries his tears and asks if there are others like him there. He points to a photo on the wall of 7 children. Khan asks if La'an is there to take him away, but she tells him he's right where he needs to be. She gets up and walks out the door. We can hear security in the background. La'an turns around, looks at Khan, and presses the button. She materializes back in the corridor of the Enterprise. She heads to the bridge, and we see that she's back in her own timeline. La'an gets back to her quarters, and an agent from the Department of Temporal Investigations is waiting for her. La'an isn't allowed to talk to anyone about what happened. She says she killed to protect a mass murderer. The time agent, or whatever the hell she is, tells La'an she protected the timeline in a way that no one else could have, and takes back the time device. Alone in her room, La'an still has the Timex watch. She then calls up Lieutenant Kirk, and of course he doesn't know her. She pretends to be seeking info about Sam. He says if she wants the real dirt on Sam to buy him a drink next time they're on Starbase together, and he signs off. La'an is left alone in her quarters, crying. The end. This could have been fleshed out to be on the Hallmark Movies and Mysteries channel. However, it failed horribly miserably, trying to be both romance and Star Trek. There were so many logic holes in this, I don't even know where to start. I guess I'll just start with, now we have proof this is not original series timeline, because obviously the Khan thing didn't happen in 1993 like it was supposed to. So this is definitely not same timeline.
And if this isn't the same timeline, since this Spock came from Discovery, then we know that Discovery is not in a proper timeline either. This is a multiverse setup.
Yep.
I think all of these Secret Hideout Star Treks, including Picard Season 3, is all in multiverse. These are all separate multiverses. This is not the original timeline. It might be that prime timeline that they made for those JJ films, but this is not the original continuity. When I'm looking at this episode, it started off very similar to last week in my mind, as far as I could see they were trying to do something here. So last week, they were trying to remake in their own way The Measure of a Man. That trial scene, they wanted that courtroom scene so that they could say we had our courtroom scene. This episode was trying to be the time travel episode, The City on the Edge of Forever, or in The Next Generation, you have Yesterday's Enterprise. There were elements of both in this. I'm not willing to be as kind as I was to last week's episode, because there were all these references. Remember that time in TOS when Kirk beat Spock playing chess? Oh, well, in this episode, Ace Ventura is going to go to the park and win a bunch of money playing chess. Remember in a piece of the action when Kirk got in the car and the car drove backwards for a few? Well, Kirk got in the car and it drove backwards for a second or two. He had it in the wrong gear. Molly mentioned this. She said, it's almost like they used AI to write this episode. This is beyond Easter eggs. If indeed that shop behind Ace Ventura and Discount Drummer, when they were first appeared in Toronto, if that was a Keeler doctor, that's an Easter egg. It's in the background. You got to look for it. And I'm not even sure that was a thing, just maybe. When you put stuff in the foreground, that's not an Easter egg. You might say it's homage, but it cannot be an Easter egg. The reason you call it an Easter egg is based on Easter egg hunts. And you have to look for Easter eggs if you remember the tradition for doing Easter egg hunts. They're hidden. You have to find them. If it's in the open, it's not an Easter egg. What they were doing here almost felt like a parody. This felt like a live-action version of Lower Decks to me. As Molly pointed out, because Molly watches a lot of those Hallmark mysteries, not only was the storyline between Ace Ventura and Discount Drummer similar to the type of dynamics you have in those movies, but even the way it was shot and the actors, just the way they look, especially Ace Ventura, he looks like one of them guys from those movies. This was not a very good episode. I watched it on Friday, and then we rewatched it again as Molly was taking notes. It got worse on second watch. On second watch, if something is worse, that it probably isn't very good. So, although I am going to say, similar to last week, I can see they were trying to do something here. I thought they put a better effort into last week. I said, I don't know how to call last week's. They were trying to do something, but I don't know what they were trying to do. This, I knew what they were trying to do. It just wasn't very good.
This was also the longest episode this season, and there were definitely parts where it could have been edited down to create a tighter story. It's just a shame because they did have a lot of elements there that could have worked. Problem is that they needed to do some editing and they really needed to work on their internal logic because a lot of things, when you started thinking about them, didn't make sense. And it really came down to this episode was nothing but character development for La'an. It was all her personal journey. And when you think about that, it had zero impact on the continuity of the show or any other characters in the show, with possibly the exception of Commander Pelia. And I fully expected Commander Pelia to go to La'an in her quarters to console her, but she didn't. There might have been a look that passed between them on the bridge when La'an got back, but overall, I was surprised because Pelia must realize that there is no one that La'an can talk to about this. She's the only one, and she didn't do anything. And again, I think that comes down to just poor writing. These writers, they don't seem to really understand what they're doing. Like, they can get so far, but they just can't make it to that next level. And I didn't look to see who wrote this episode, but some of it feels like this is just inexperience, that you have writers who are prioritizing feelings over logic and continuity in a science fiction television show. And when it says Star Trek on there, you bet your ass things better make sense. But for some reason, they don't feel like it has to. And that's very perplexing to me because you can have both. A skilled writer can give you both, but for some reason, they choose not to. And I just don't get it.
My question about this episode, and I do agree, this was about Discount Drummer, and it was an attempt at character development. What journey did she take? What was the growth that she did?
I think, again, it was set out in a confusing manner because at the beginning of the episode, they try to portray her as a loner who refuses to ask for help. Through working with alternate Kirk, she's forced to realize that she has to work with him and rely on him, and she learns to do that. However, there was also another theme running through it that she learns to see her ancestor Khan in a different light, to let go of her, I don't know, embarrassment or shame over her heritage. And the thing is that this whole loner thing, that seemed to come out of nowhere. Previously, she and Una had a close relationship, so they could have dealt with the fact that there's now a distance between them, now that she knows that Una wasn't being honest with her this whole time. So, I mean, that came out of nowhere. They created that just so that they could set up that theme of learning to trust somebody else through the episode. However, They already had something about her learning to accept herself and not be ashamed of her heritage. Why didn't they deal with that in last week's episode with Una's trial? I guess they kind of started that with the conversation she had with Nira, but I don't like the way that they've set this television show up, because it seems like every single episode is about a different character's personal journey. And I don't want to be watching a show about everybody's personal journey. I thought I was watching a Star Trek show where we would be working together toward a common goal and not just everybody talking about their damn feelings about themselves.
What strange new world did they visit this week? I guess Toronto?
Modern Toronto.
The mighty people from Toronto were the strange new world. So if you're from Toronto, how do you like being considered a strange new world? In addition to relying on other people, they introduced this thing also about getting close to somebody, and then Ace Ventura and her got close, like romantically close, that did not follow at all in the story, except they wrote it. There was nothing there that explained why they grew close. He was an idiot. And I mean an idiot. I don't know how in this alternate timeline where he is captain of an Earth vessel, because the Federation didn't exist, because I guess we should explain that. The whole point behind this is the theory was if you bumped off Khan, that the eugenics wars wouldn't have happened, and then World War III, and then there wouldn't have been this working together enlightenment to move people from warfare to the stars. I do not understand that storyline, period. And I'm going to go into some TOS stuff, and I might get this wrong, so feel free to correct me in the comments. If I remember Space Seed correctly, Spock said something like there were some 90 or 100 missing people.
It was 80 to 90.
80 or 90 people that escaped from that time period that were genetically modified. And then later on in Space Seed, there was an explanation that there were dozens of dictators on the planet. And even when Khan was getting sort of interrogated at that dinner, and he let slip a few things, but one of the things he let slip was eventually one person would have ruled over them all, which implied him. But that also says he didn't get to that point. He did have a very large section of the Earth, but he didn't have it completely. And then also in that episode, Kirk and McCoy and Scotty were pointing out how under Khan's rule, there wasn't any massacres and there wasn't any war until he was attacked. So what I don't understand is if you kill Khan, but not the program, one of those other genetically modified people are just going to do the same thing, and the same eugenics wars are still going to happen. This isn't a Hitler case where in that particular moment, if Hitler's killed, you may have to wait decades for another Hitler to rise to power. These people were all existing at the same time. So I don't understand, if Khan is killed, unless you take out all of them, how does that work? And then this gets into more lore here, and this is the stuff I'm a bit shakier on. So feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But it's my understanding there was a spin-off comic book by IDW for Star Trek Into Darkness, JJ Trek. And in that, they set up that there were 7 dominant augments that were given the kingdoms of the world, or they were told to go out and take over the kingdoms of the world, or whatever it was. How does that mesh with what Spock said in Space Seed about dozens of dictators that were running the planet? I don't understand the plan here. Killing Khan, I don't think fixes anything, because you're still going to have one of the other ones rise and take over power. They already did. He was the dominant one, but there were dozens of them.
Well, this comes back to the fact that logic doesn't matter, because this was about La'an's personal journey. And this had to do with her confronting Khan. That's what all of this was about. It was all about that. So nothing else mattered.
Another thing I have a question about, and again, somebody please educate me, because this is a piece of Star Trek lore I'm not very well versed in. But I'm saying only what was presented on screen. No IDW comic book and no novel from the 90s. Just what was on screen. TOS and maybe part of TNG. I always made the assumption, based on Space Seed and MacGyver's when she was painting Khan and she covered it up and then Khan came into her quarters and looked at it and he was wearing traditional clothing for somebody from northern India. I just assumed that these genetic people were made across the planet. They weren't at a central Toronto facility being made. I thought that concept of being at a central facility was introduced in the IDW Star Trek Into Darkness comic. So to me, that kind of rubbed me a little bit the wrong way. That doesn't mean I'm correct here, because much like T'Pring and Amok Time, I made the assumption that after they took their vows when they were kids, they didn't see each other until Amok Time. But apparently in Star Trek Strange New Worlds, they lived in the margins and said, no, there was nothing in there that said they didn't see each other between when they were children and Amok Time. So I'm wondering if this is the same type of thing. Maybe I just made a bad interpretation, because I guess what they're saying here is these people were made in a common place in Toronto. And they had 7 people in that picture on Khan's wall, or Khan's dresser, whatever that was, the picture. And that 7 lines up with the IDW comic book where you had the 7 kingdoms. But Spock said there were dozens of these people who took over the world. And then he also said there was 80 or 90 of them that were unaccounted for. So if we discount the IDW comic book stuff, is there anything in lore that says they were made at a common facility, these genetic people? And yes, I know Enterprise touched on this a little bit, but I also cross off Enterprise because that was decades after Space Seed was introduced and that storyline was fleshed out. So it just seems to me like it's open to interpretation, kind of like T'Pring. But apparently what this is trying to say, at least in this multiverse, is there was a facility in Toronto called the Noonien Singh Institute, which I'm guessing his dad set it up. I don't know why it's called the Noonien Singh Institute. And that these genetically engineered people were made in one common place in Toronto. And I don't understand that. Then after they were made, they were just shuffled off, like in the comic book, to different places. I just assumed that scientists across the world were trying to make better human beings, and that all this conflict happened as they were all trying to one-up the other one when it came to their experiments. But that's my guesswork. That's based on being a child watching TOS and in my head making up the continuity. If somebody else has a better explanation for why I'm mistaken here, please share with me, because I'm open to the idea that I just made a bad interpretation as a kid on how all these genetic people came aboard on the planet. The second thing, third, fourth, fifth, I got a whole bunch here. Spock. Spock appeared in this alternate timeline. And in this timeline, I guess because Khan was killed, the Federation never formed, Starfleet never formed, so they had this United Earth thing. And Spock was a Vulcan captain talking to Captain Ace Ventura. But how could Spock be? That was Amanda and Sarek, the parents. But if humans and Vulcans never commingled, how could Captain Spock be a thing?
He wouldn't.
There are so many questions. Then Ortegas, the joke I've seen online is even with the shifted timeline, she has that stupid haircut, which is true. I do believe she was at the navigation station, not helm. So I think that's a slight difference, but still. And then going along with this, the rest of the ship looked the same. I don't know if we saw an exterior shot of the Enterprise, but the interior looked the same. When Discount Drummer was talking to Ace Ventura, and Ace Ventura was bragging about his timeline and how the Earth did great things like colonies on the Moon and Mars and Venus and Europa. And then Discount Drummer mentioned about how they're spread all amongst the stars now. So is this United Earth, whatever the heck, United Earth something, I forget what the organization was called, but were they just a solar system based entity? If their biggest bragging points were all these solar system items, Europa, Venus, Mars? Kind of makes me feel like The Expanse, because The Expanse, for most of it, was based just in our solar system. I'm confused about that. At the very beginning of the episode, they had Dr. M'Benga, and he was the sparring partner for Discount Drummer. And one of the moves that he did, Dr. M'Benga kind of used a little bit of, I'm going to be kind and call it judo, but I'm being way too kind there. He used some judo to throw her on the ground, and she's like, "What's that?" And he's like, "Well, I used your own weight against you." Where I thought this was going was Discount Drummer was going to go down a path realizing she doesn't have to be the strongest, the best, the whatever. So, like, when she was fighting that Romulan, and she was getting her ass kicked left and right, which, by the way, the choreography on this was horrible. They shook the camera massively, and it was covering up the horrible choreography. But it was all standing up and fighting. So when Discount Drummer got knocked down the second time, and then the Romulan was above her, what I thought she was going to do was mixed martial arts. I thought she was going to pull the Romulan into her guard, and she was going to use some sort of grappling to beat her, based on what Dr. M'Benga did earlier in the episode. Nope. She just stuck it out and got a hold of a gun and shot her. So I don't really understand what that Dr. M'Benga's speech had to do with anything in this episode at all.
I agree. I fully expected her to use her own momentum against her when La'an was fighting Sarah. But then it didn't happen. And I'm like, well, what was the point of that? Again, there were a lot of things like that. Like, what was the point of that? A lot of this writing was just, I don't know, like, didn't they edit this at all before they went into production?
This episode seemed cheap. They were filming on the streets of Toronto, which reminded me of season 2 of Picard when they were on the streets of LA and Agboard was eating car batteries. Because that's cheap. Let's just stick some cameras on the location where we're at, done. And they were doing this in Toronto. Now we gotta talk about the scene here that we laughed so hard. The hot dog scene. I don't know if these writers are capable of understanding double entendres. However, when Kirkwood kept trying to give her a hot dog and she was refusing the hot dog, and then later when he said, well, sometimes you just got to take a good hot dog when it's there. I don't know if that was accidentally just there or if they intended that, but that was there. There was an obsession over hot dogs for a while, and it was definitely, whether they meant it or not, a double entendre. My inner Beavis and Butthead were going,
Yeah, he tried giving her a hot dog that had no condiments on it. Who's going to eat that?
She didn't want it either. He kept trying to shove the hot dog on her, and she didn't want it. Then at the end, she reluctantly took it, but you never saw her eat it.
No.
And then he's like, well, I'm going to go back and give me like 2 more hot dogs. Again, if that was planned, if that was a planned comedic moment, then okay, I did laugh. But based on like when Ortegas tries to clown around and she's like not funny at all, it turns out I looked her up. She's supposed to be a comedian. How can a comedian not be funny? But whatever.
It depends on the lines she's given. I don't know. I've never seen her trying to do anything else, so I really can't say. But yeah, the material that she has for this, not funny at all.
But this hot dog scene was funny. I laughed. I laughed quite hard, actually. Both you and I were going, and then when she refused the hot dog, I don't want that hot dog. Because in the episode, they were trying to make Ace Ventura their version of charming, which I guess is to act like an idiot. And I don't know how Discount Drummer was attracted to that at all, other than desperation. They miscast this actor for James Kirk. This actor not only does not have any charisma whatsoever, but he has no leadership ability at all. Discount Drummer was running everything, and what Ace Ventura reminded me of, if you remember the old sitcom Cheers from the 80s, he reminded me of Sam Malone. When Sam and Diane would like spat back and forth, you had the intelligent Diane and then Sam, the ex-baseball player. And that's what it reminded me of. And I guess that's supposed to be charming? I don't know.
I just can't imagine if La'an does like hot dogs, why she would be attracted to that hot dog. I'm just saying. I'm just saying. Because
well, as he said, hey, when a good hot dog comes your way, you got to take advantage of it. So he was like, hey, I'm all you got, lady, so here you go.
I'm sure she could have found better if she'd looked around the city.
I think she would have done better just at looking in the hotel.
There wasn't really any chemistry there. Again, she is a very stoic and I mean, I hate to say powerful, but I mean, she works in security. Her ancestor is Khan. This guy was just a weenie goofball with his hot dog in his hand. When he did take charge of a situation, for instance, like the car thing, that ended up with them getting stopped by the cops. When he tried to take charge of the situation, when Sarah was standing there with a gun on them, he ends up dead on the floor. So, you know, when they were back on the Enterprise originally, he tried grabbing the device from her. They end up both back in, 2022 Toronto.
When they were in Toronto, and there's a giant sign that says Toronto in front of him. Yeah, I think this is New York.
Ugh.
Which I don't know if that was a dig at William Shatner and just making fun of William Shatner not knowing what Canada is, because Kirk, maybe I'm reading too much into this because I really dislike Secret Hideout Star Trek. So maybe I'm just reading too much into that, but one could make the argument that they were making fun of William Shatner because they were in Canada and he didn't even know it. At least Captain Kirk didn't even know that.
Well, they were certainly showing that this Captain Kirk is definitely not Canadian. So I don't know if that was a dig at Shatner. I certainly hope it wasn't. I think that might have just been their attempt at writing something that they thought was funny and clever. But if it was, then that's in really, really poor taste.
I mean, the character Kirk was born in the U.S., but the actor William Shatner is from Canada. I'm already trying to cut off the comments before somebody tries to explain the difference there. So I just didn't know if they were trying to get a dig at William Shatner or not. Maybe they weren't, and that's just me reading into that.
Well, with them, who can tell?
Yeah, exactly. I don't put anything past them, because we know later on this season they're going to have a Lower Decks crossover episode. And that's less problematic now because they've already established this is a multiverse. This is a multiverse we know for sure. Because this Spock came from Discovery, we now know Discovery is part of that multiverse. So at least we now have proof that both Discovery and Strange New Worlds is not in the original continuity. This is some alternate multiverse timeline. And I guess that's good news. That was the one good thing to come out of this episode. And I guess one quick thing here regarding the time agencies. Again, this is a weak spot for me. If somebody wants to educate me, please do. But I thought there were two types of time investigators in Star Trek as far as Berman era. One was in Deep Space Nine. I thought it was contemporary day in Deep Space Nine investigators that whenever there was a temporal problem, they would investigate what happened and debrief the people who experienced it and so forth. And then in Enterprise, there were these time agents that were fighting that temporal Cold War, and they shifted through time. Am I misunderstanding the difference between the two? Because I'm guessing that the time agent that appeared at the very end of this Strange New Worlds episode, I'm guessing she was part of that Enterprise. By Enterprise, I mean the Scott Bakula Enterprise, temporal Cold War type agency. Am I misremembering the difference? Because in Deep Space Nine, they did have time agents, but they weren't really, my understanding was they didn't shift through time. They just debriefed the people who went through any sort of temporal experience. But correct me if I'm wrong. Deep Space Nine is not my strongest series because I've mentioned before, I have lots of problems with Deep Space Nine, so it's not my strongest field. So maybe I misunderstood. Maybe Deep Space Nine were part of those temporal Cold War type agents. But I don't think so. I think they were separate people. So I'm assuming this lady was from the Enterprise temporal Cold War type stuff. The whole story I just don't understand. I don't understand other than they wanted to have their time episode. They wanted to have their version of the city on the edge of forever. And this was not a very good job. They did better last week with their convoluted attempt at the measure of a man. At least there was something there you could have worked with. Molly's being very kind, saying there's stuff here they could have worked with, which there was, but it was so far away from a legitimate story. Last week's, I think, would have taken less script doctoring to fix last week. This week, there was a lot you had to fix. And all this was, to me, was just member berries all over the place. In that institute, the Noonien Singh Institute, if we remember from Picard, Season 2, one of the Soongs, I forget what There's like 15 different Soongs running around now. But he picked up that pamphlet that said Project Khan or whatever. So I guess that's tying into this. But I just make the argument, Khan isn't that important. There were dozens of these genetically engineered people that were fighting in the eugenics wars. One person, this guy wasn't that important. He might have been the best of them, being able to dominate the other ones, but there were other ones there. There were more ruthless ones there. They even mentioned that or implied that in Space Seed. So killing Khan, I don't see how that fixes anything. I don't see how that makes a darn bit of difference. And I don't understand what the Romulan was doing. How did she go back in time? Did they find out about the slingshot procedure? How did she get back? They didn't bother to explain that. And this lady did not appear to be a Romulan in any way that I would recall. Her speech patterns, the way, I guess she was trying to acclimate, so you could argue she picked up local speech patterns. I don't know.
Even so, you would think after she was exposed, she would have reverted back to being a proper Romulan instead of playing the role of human at that point. But she didn't. She just kept on talking like she was a modern, at that point in time, human. And kind of a ditzy one at that. So to me, that just didn't really work well. But again, it comes back to, I think they set out to write this episode so that La'an could come to grips with her heritage by coming face to face with little boy Khan. And then they wrote the rest of the episode around it.
I could have gotten on board with just what you explained, because you didn't put any of this other crappy details in there. The last episode, I argued in our last review, should have been about Discount Drummer as much as it was about Una. But it wasn't. So this would have been part 2 of that. And had it have been something, she was coming to grips with her heritage and where she came from in Khan Noonien Singh, I could get on board with that generic story. But not this story. I mean, there are little details like the hand scanner, and it seemed like it was scanning your fingerprints, but then it was scanning your DNA. And then, to me, that was a confirmation that there was enough DNA in Discount Drummer where they were tying her back to Khan Noonien Singh. So then going back to last week, why is she allowed to serve in Starfleet? Because she still has enough of that augmentation where a scanner from the 21st century could link the two and not tell them apart. I have questions, loads and loads of questions in this episode, which is what I said last week. What I think is last week was a better attempt, as convoluted as it was, that was a better attempt at an episode than this was. This was a better attempt at making a Hallmark mystery movie than it was making Star Trek. There's less things to fix if you just say, look, I'm going to make a Hallmark mystery movie here. There's less script doctoring you have to do to fix that.
There wouldn't be as many problems if this was not trying to be Star Trek, because then you wouldn't have to try to fit in with the different timelines and things like that. You could have just written your own thing, and then a lot of the continuity issues just disappear. And it kind of makes me wonder if somebody had written this as something else, like a separate standalone, movie or something like that, and they just kind of cut and paste and made it into a Star Trek episode instead.
Yeah, this was an hour long. This episode, I think, even problems and all, you could have told in 40 minutes. There was no reason for it to be an hour long, and it felt like it was an hour long. It dragged in the middle big time. The Carol Kane character, this did nothing to make me like her. She's apparently a thief that steals art. She's using that accent again where you have to turn the subtitles on to understand what she's saying. This was essentially what Guinan's character was in Season 2 of Picard. This episode, I mean. I would argue they should have had Guinan from Picard. Maybe it would have made more sense. Last week, I wasn't sure what to say, whether it was good or bad. This week, I'm feeling fairly confident to say this was a bad episode. It's a bad episode that at least I can see they were trying to do something, but they failed miserably. They tried to shove way too much homage in this episode for me to actually give it credit as making a legitimate attempt at making a Star Trek episode.
I think this would have worked better for people who aren't familiar with Star Trek. Like I said, and you said, this belonged on the Hallmark Movies and Mysteries channel. So if people didn't know about the member berries and the continuity stuff. I think they might have actually just enjoyed this just as a romance. But when you try to add in the Star Trek portion of things, it falls apart completely.
If you stripped out the Star Trek pieces and just made a rom-com, complete with the hot dog joke and everything, there's less script doctoring needed to make that episode of something.
Yeah. Yeah, and that comes back to what I've been saying all along. They just want to write a soap opera with a Star Trek skin on it. And it seems like they kind of put the skin on last. And that's why it doesn't fit. I don't even know what else to say about it at this point. They keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. They keep strip mining past episodes and twisting them and then regurgitating them.
They don't visit any strange new worlds.
Yeah, I don't even know what to say.
They don't even have Pike in this. He only appeared at the very end. Is Pike starring in this series or not?
It doesn't feel like it. I mean, what, do they have to pay him like a quarter salary if they only use him a quarter of the time?
He was in one scene, I think, at the very end.
I know. Yeah.
When Carol Kane was trying to argue her way out of all the stolen stuff in her quarters. And I guess that was supposed to be funny. I guess speaking along of the funny, and I didn't find this funny, both times, there were 2 times in this episode where they mentioned a socialist utopia, and like they were spinning it in a negative tone of voice. I have never claimed Star Trek is a utopia, and I don't like using the term socialism because what Star Trek practices is not what current socialism is in the world. When you get rid of the need to survive, that's that post-scarcity. That's where Star Trek is, where you don't have to just work to survive. There are other things to explore. I would not call that a utopia. You can't ever reach utopia. Utopia is a concept. You can't ever get there. And then calling it something like socialism, I disagree that that's what Star Trek is. It's something else. It's not socialism.
Yeah, it's post-scarcity, and that's different.
Post-scarcity would be the type of system set up, not socialism. So anyway, I want to make sure I got that in there because they got 2 digs in there.
It's because they look down on half the audience, and they were trying to really shove that down their throats. And it doesn't work because they don't know what they're doing. Plus, most people don't like the show anyway, so they don't really care.
I don't know why people like this show. I really don't. Other than it wastes time. You don't have anything better to do with your time. You got 1 hour a week and you want to watch this. Hey, you guys are watching this. Yeah, for reviews of this channel. I guarantee you, if we weren't doing reviews, we would not be watching this stuff. After 3 or 4 episodes of season 1, we knew this wasn't for us. We want to catalog the destruction of the Star Trek franchise. And that's what they're doing here. They've done it here. They've done it in Picard. They've done it in Discovery. They've destroyed Star Trek, and I do not know how you get it back other than, and maybe this is the beginning, if this is the beginning of admitting all these Secret Hideout series are in this other set of multiverses, and that their concept of Prime in the JJ films, Prime is just a name they give it. It's not the original continuity. It's just original continuity like. Maybe this is the first step of actually getting this stuff in the bubble that it needs to be in, these little bubble multiverses, and we can start asking CBS to start making proper Star Trek.
I don't understand why they were so adamant in the first place that this isn't in the Kelvin timeline or some other timeline. They kept trying to convince us that this was original.
For credibility.
Well, yeah, but all it did was make people angry and turn people off. If they'd just been upfront from the very beginning, there are a lot of people out there who are perfectly okay with multiverse stories.
What if stories?
I'm not one of those people. I don't like multiverse stuff. However, I know that there are a lot of people out there, especially in comic book circles, who do like that kind of stuff. So why not just be honest and market it to the people who would actually like your stuff? I don't get it. Why make people angry and hate you?
Again, all I can think of is they thought there was a crap ton of money to be made here, and they thought gaslighting people into thinking this was a continuation of Roddenberry and then later Berman Trek, that they just thought they could continue making money. This goes back to the JJ stuff. All this stuff has its origins at the JJ 2009 film. The Kelvin stuff seemed harmless because it was in the Kelvin timeline. But when they introduced this Prime crap, that's the one that nobody saw coming from the back door. People kept thinking this Prime thing, because it had Leonard Nimoy in it, that this was somehow the original continuity. And it's like, no, it's not. It can't be. And all this stuff is spun off of that created Prime universe that they made in the JJ film.
I guess it just comes down to how little they think of the viewers. They really thought that they could just tell us, well, this is, original timeline or Prime, and trick us into thinking it's original timeline. And we would just buy it and just move on. But that didn't work. Again, though, they completely underestimated the average viewer.
I don't understand, of all the audiences of all the different genres and franchises.
Why would you screw with this one?
Star Trek fans, from going back all the way to the 60s, specifically the 70s, when they rejuvenated it in the fan circles, they're meticulous about these details. They memorized all 3 seasons, the technology, the characters, the lore. Why would you go after Star Trek? Of all the lore that you want to screw with, Star Trek people, they are that stereotype of somebody who sits there and has nothing else better to do than to memorize all 3 seasons of the original series. And then you've got the next generation of that, pun intended, of those that memorize Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager. So why would you go after Star Trek as the franchise? Hey, we're going to go into this thing and warp it all around. These people won't know the difference.
It was clear they didn't understand it. They just thought they could walk right in there like any other franchise and just put their mark on it, and everybody would just accept that. These
people, they know the measurements of the original bridge. They have copies of the blueprints of the original Desilu Bridge. I remember some fan films going at it because one said they had the more accurate Enterprise bridge than the other one because they were bringing out dimensions and stuff. And you're going to try and sit there and pull this crap on those type of people?
Again, they grossly underestimated Star Trek fans. It comes down to arrogance, and I'm just going to say this, sheer fucking hubris. They really think that they're just that much more clever than the rest of us, and they can just get away with this crap.
So far, they have gotten away with it.
Yeah.
However, Discovery's going to be done. Picard's done.
Prodigy's
done. Maybe they are finally running out of rope here, and this is the end of it. Maybe this is the end of Strange New Worlds, and maybe this is the end of that crappy Star Trek. There hopefully no Section 31 series. They announced that a couple of months ago, that's going to be a mini-series, I think they said it was.
Let's face it, even though Secret Hideout's contract got renewed, they were doing other shows, not just Star Trek. So we don't know exactly what their contract was renewed to do.
But we did hear about the Section 31 miniseries. They made a big deal about talking about that.
That doesn't mean it's going to happen.
That's true. I just hope this is toward the end. At least now we know this is in an alternate timeline. It's a multiverse. We now have it confirmed. So when people say, yeah, it's in this Prime continuity, you can go, yeah, it sure is. That's not the original continuity. We know that because the Romulan in this episode, she gave lines of dialogue that said this was supposed to happen in the 90s, the Khan Rising. But because of fiddling with the time period, it shifted things and delayed things decades. So that's the line when people are saying, I've heard other people talk about, they finally admit this is a different continuity. Well, what is that? I don't remember in the episode. It's when the Romulans said that this should have happened in the 90s, but it got delayed several decades. That's admitting this is a different continuity.
Yes, when the villain was telling her secret plan before she actually enacted secret plan, and then she gets thwarted from enacting secret plan. But she had to spell out her secret plan so that the hero could hear it.
That Romulan could have manipulated Discount Drummer without telling her the plan. I mean, she could have manipulated her. I give them credit, because this is another tech thing I want to... At least in this episode, they seem to understand the concept of cold fusion a little bit better. Because in Into Darkness, if I'm remembering correctly, when that volcano was going off at the beginning, they lowered some cold fusion device to put the volcano out, and it was stupid.
Oh, God.
So at least they learned that. I mean, was it a decade later? At least they learned that that's not what cold fusion is. Something that's so cold it's going to put out a volcano. So progress? Needless to say.
They actually think that was because of the coldness, or was this like a Gilligan's Island when the professor threw a bomb into the active volcano?
We would have to look, because I only watched that movie once. But as I remember, it's the very beginning when they had those natives and they were running.
Yeah, I remember that part. I don't remember the rest of that.
And I believe Spock was lowering what they called a cold fusion device to put the volcano out so it wouldn't explode and destroy those people. It was going to freeze the volcano.
That's worse logic than Gilligan's Island.
The whole concept of that first film was that Gilligan's Island story of, we're going to drop a bomb in a volcano to make the supernova go away. And it was the Gilligan's Island volcano episode. That was the 2009 plot. It's stupid. The whole supernova that ate up the universe.
Gilligan's Island was better.
Well, yeah, Gilligan's Island's better than any of this Secret Hideout crap, any of this bad robot stuff.
The professor's, his inventions are way better than the stuff we get on here. I mean, maybe it does work. Maybe the tritium would set off the old Timex watch. I don't know, but that just seemed so Gilligan's Island.
At the very beginning of the episode, well, toward the beginning, when Ace Ventura and Discount Drummer got transported to Toronto, Discount Drummer's first line was, "Do you have a tricorder on you?" She was in the office with him. Do you know what a tricorder looks like in TOS era? What, does he have that big square box shoved down his pants? Like, where did you think he was hiding that? That was a stupid line.
Maybe she thought it was on the back of his belt. I don't know.
No, it's got that strap with the big box on it. At least that's how it used to be in TOS. No, I don't have a tricorder. Did you see me with the tricorder as I was in my office talking to you?
Well, maybe the alternate timeline has watch-based tricorders.
Yeah. Their comm badge is a tricorder. Wasn't that... Was it Picard? I'm trying to remember we saw something where they had the comm badges that were... Oh, no, Discovery had, like, the holographic comm badges.
Oh, yeah, that was so bad. Oh, my God. Yeah, well, it comes back to the writing. This was clearly not written by someone who was an expert in Trek technology, especially what was supposed to be appropriate for that part of the timeline. And they didn't have anybody go over it afterward who could fix little problems like that throughout the script. And one little problem plus 5 other little problems, all of a sudden you got a big problem.
The real problem here, because that's interesting where you're questioning the ability of the writers, and I agree with that, but what audience are they writing for? This feels like this is for, we said this last year, this is meant for young adults. This series, the content is meant for young adults.
Well, think about it. They had that romance, and they had the car chase. So you've got 2 sexes covered as far as, what they will think will appeal to young women and what they think will appeal to young men. And I really think this is, like you just said, written for a younger audience. However, some of the stuff from the previous season, I'm not sure how appropriate that was for that age group.
Well, we might be seeing some Gorn stuff, Xenomorph Gorn coming up here.
Yeah. You've also pointed out that the maturity level for people of a certain age isn't the same now as it was, say, 30 years ago.
No, I think what used to be 25, 24 years old back when I was younger, it takes people to get 35 or 40 now to get to that emotional development level. So it's like a decade delayed. So if you're writing for people that you think are 24 now, back in my day, I think that's what like 14, 15-year-olds were getting into. I don't know why we're emotionally stunted now as a culture, but we appear to be.
I'm going to blame helicopter parents for not letting their kids do anything. Gen X got the shit kicked out of them because we were kicked out of the house in the morning, and our parents had no idea what we were up to until the streetlights came on at night.
I don't have anything more to say about this episode. This was, on second watching especially, this was worse than last week's. Like last week, they were trying to do something, but unlike last week, where at least I was giving them credit for trying, this wasn't a real try. This was just half-assing. This was a half-ass attempt at trying to give Trek people what they think they want.
Again, they put far more effort into the romance portion than they did into the Star Trek portion.
The Star Trek portion was just homage. Like, that was almost entirely what the Star Trek piece was. Homage.
If they stripped out the Star Trek stuff and just marketed this as generic romance mystery, they would have had a fine time. And that's not Star Trek. So, in some ways, this episode was far less offensive than a lot of previous episodes have been, but in other ways, it's so obvious that they don't really care about continuity, and this is definitely a different timeline, and we're supposed to just sit back and say, I remember, while we watch our new rom-com.
I personally was insulted by this episode. I thought it was a character assassination, at least for James T. Kirk. The guy's an idiot in this. He's an idiot. I don't know how this guy became anything. He's an idiot. He really is that character from that short Trek.
Well, that's what I've come to expect from their writing.
I'm trying to remember what his name was. The short Trek guy where the captain said, well, he was an idiot. He was too stupid to live. Yeah, Edward.
It was Edward. Yeah.
This is essentially Edward. He's just stupid. They try to pass off being stupid as charming. Okay, that's not James Kirk at all. James Kirk is charming. He's not an idiot. Well, this is him younger. Yeah, but he was a captain on this alternate reality, and he didn't even have any of the basics of leadership. How is he a captain?
Again, if you look at this, and that's not James T. Kirk, that's generic romance movie guy, it gets a whole lot less offensive.
Agreed. But because he was called James T. Kirk, it was a character assassination.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So that's what I said. You know, if this was just a generic romance movie, it would have a few problems, but overall, the offensive nature disappears. It's when it tries to be Star Trek that you really have a huge problem. Because, like you pointed out, it is character assassination. There are continuity issues. It relies heavily on member berries. But at the very least, we got confirmation that all of this new Trek stuff is all a separate timeline.
They had a piece of dialogue making fun of Tiberius, the middle name Tiberius. Discount Drummer was making fun of that name. That's why I said this is a character assassination of James T. Kirk. That's why it did offend me. I agree with you. If I just forget and just strip all the Star Trek stuff out, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't watch it, but I would, flipping around, I could see this being on the Hallmark Channel. Okay. Who knows? Maybe these actors, after this gig is done, maybe they're destined to be in Hallmark movies. And I'm not saying that as an insult. Maybe this is a good screen test for them to actually get into Hallmark movies after this run is done of Strange New Worlds.
Hey, for a lot of actors, it's steady work, especially when they're too old to be in much of anything else. So, I mean, I'm not going to ding actors who do go that route because I think they're performing a service. They're getting paid for it. However, the writers on this, stop pretending like you're writing Star Trek. At least you're not pretending that it's in original timeline anymore. But you'd be better off to stop pretending this is Star Trek altogether. Because
well, certainly not original timeline anymore.
It would be less offensive.
They got rid of the illusion this is original timeline.
Yeah.
So at least there's that. This episode accomplished that. So that is the only positive of this episode, is it confirms what we all suspected for a long time. This is an alternate timeline. Discovery's an alternate timeline. And we don't have to worry about how this is destroying proper continuity because they admitted it's a separate continuity. So, yay.
Crap timeline. Well, that's really all I have to say about that. As a generic romance, you know what? They would have been better off trying to turn it into that than trying to make this Star Trek. As Star Trek, it fails miserably. Anybody else watch this episode? What were your thoughts on this? Did you see anything in this that we missed as far as I remember? Or is there some other comment you'd like to make about this as far as continuity, Star Trek, or even romance? Leave your comments in the space below.
Take care.